it has been over 250 Famidaily episodes since we saw a Rockman game. We're not going to have that kind of gap again. For some reason, the Rockman series skipped a release in 1989, but from this point on, Rockman is a yearly franchise. Rockman 3 is also the only Rockman game not to be released in the holiday season. Usually this game is Capcom's tentpole release for the year, but Rockman 3 is out all by itself in September. The game has a subtitle, Dr. Wiley no Saigo, or The Death of Dr. Wiley. It seems that Capcom had intended this to be the end of the series, though we've got a long way to go just on the Famicom. The plot of Rockman 3 is that after the end of the previous game, Dr. Wiley reformed and decided to build a giant robot for peaceful purposes. Then one day, robots started going crazy again. Who could possibly be behind this? You know the drill. 8 robots, each have their own stage, they give you their weapon when you kill them. It's a winning formula. Rockman 3 is the longest of the classic Rockman games. There's 17 stages, not counting the single-screen boss fight, and 21 distinct bosses. They padded that number in a strange way, because Rockman 3 contains all of the bosses from Rockman 2. They didn't have enough memory for the sprites, so instead you get one still image of the robot descending into a common body. It actually makes them more difficult in many cases, because the body is much larger than their original form, and if the robot master is programmed to aggressively pursue you, they have an easier time getting to you. On the other hand, they did break Flashman's time stopper. My usual process here is to record for about an hour to make sure I have enough footage to work with and plenty of time to deal with the commentary and video editing. I played Rockman 3 for 90 minutes, and that put me at the end of the 12th stage. Now obviously I'm not a speedrunner, but I also only continued once during that time, so it's not like I ever actually got stuck. It's just that this is a big game. At least there's a password system when you get a game over, or when you pass certain milestones in the game. There are 3 significant changes here from Rockman 2. First, the special items that give you additional movement abilities have been given a personality by turning them into a robot dog. This is the game that introduces Rockman's pet, Rush. And Rush is a very good boy. You start out with the Rush coil, where he launches you up from a spring on his back, but as you clear the initial 8 robot masters, you'll get 2 more modes for Rush. The Rush Marine, which turns him into a submarine, that is not the most helpful of items, and the Rush Jet, where he turns into a flying board that you can ride on. The second major addition is that now Mega Man can slide. Hitting down and jump sends you sliding along the ground, and you can use it to get through small gaps, but more importantly, you use it to get underneath enemies that are jumping. It's an absolutely vital move for you to use, especially on boss fights. The final big thing in Rockman 3 is the introduction of Blues, the prototype robot that Dr. Light built before Rockman. He serves as a mini-boss on a few stages, blocking your path until you do enough damage, and then he opens the way. Capcom learned from the issues with Rockman 2, and none of the weapons that you gain from the robots in Rockman 3 are especially overpowering. In fact, I'd say they're actually the game's biggest flaw. Most of the weapons are underwhelming in how similar they are. But counting them down from worst to best. Number 8, Top Spin. Yeah, of course this is the bottom. It's a real contender for the worst weapon in the Mega Man series. You spin in place and possibly do some damage to your enemy, but if you don't destroy them, you also collide with them, taking damage yourself. If you weren't required to use it to beat the game, you wouldn't use it at all. Number 7, Search Snake. These crawl around the ground and then move up a wall, and they'd be a decent weapon in most Rockman games. But for some reason, Rockman 3 lacks a lot of ground-based enemies. Most of what you fight is going to be flying, or at least leaping, and so the snakes wind up being kind of ineffective in this game. Number 6, Spark Shot. This straightforward bullet will stun regular enemies, but that winds up actually being a problem. While the enemy is stunned, you can't fire again. And while there's an electrical effect applied to the enemy that will shock anything that runs into them, it does almost no damage. This is another one that you're only going to want to break out for the bosses that are weak to it. Number 5, Gemini Laser. It does good damage, but there's two primary problems here. The special effect of it rebounding off walls turns out to not be very helpful. And the other issue is that it causes massive slowdown in the game. That means it's not going to be my first choice when attacking. Number 4, Magnet Missile. Now we're getting into the weapons that are regularly useful. The Magnet Missile will fly straight out until it's directly above or below an enemy, and then fly vertically. That makes it one of only 2 weapons in the game that can attack above you. It does decent damage too. My biggest problems with it are that it's expensive, and that the lock-on can throw you off. Number 3, Hard Knuckle. It's slow, but it does massive damage. And you can adjust its flight path by pressing up and down after you shoot, though it doesn't go that far. It should be your first choice when there's a big, slow target. Number 2, Needle Cannon. It's not any stronger than Mega Man's regular weapon, but it's auto-fire, and the shots have a little bit of a spread that let it hit things that would be below Mega Man's regular shots. That makes it a great utility weapon. And that means number 1, Shadow Blade. It's Rockman 3's answer to the Metal Blade. It's not as cheap, and not as damaging, and doesn't have the fantastic range, but because you can shoot it above you, it is by far the most versatile and useful weapon in the game. Unfortunately, Rockman 3 has its share of technical problems. The Rush Jet has a particularly helpful bug with it. Rather than having the energy count down as it's active, it counts down while you're standing on the board, and the board is always underneath you after you've jumped onto it. So if you jump onto the board and then keep jumping, the energy doesn't go down. This trick is very useful in later stages where you have to ride on the Rush Jet to get through the level, and you wouldn't have enough energy to get through it a second time if you died. Another infamous trick in the game is that if you hold down right on the second player controller, Rockman gains the ability to jump to an enormous height. You can even jump out of otherwise fatal pits that you fall down if you're holding down right as you go down them. There's one more bug in the game worth mentioning, and that's how there's a slight delay in the direction that you shoot compared to the direction that you move. If you're walking and then push in the opposite direction and fire at the exact same time, you'll continue to fire in the direction that you are walking while you turn around. That may not sound like a big deal, but Rockman 3 is also pretty difficult. For example, instead of there being one chain of bosses in the initial robots, where you could follow an optimal path through each of them, taking advantage of all of their weaknesses, there's 2 chains of robots in Rockman 3. So for 2 of those initial 8, you're probably going to be using your default weapon. Also, most of the enemies that you encounter in the game are immune to something. As you're walking around, there's no single weapon that you could equip that will carry you through the stages. Instead, if you want to change weapons according to circumstance, you're going to be swapping them fairly often, possibly even with every enemy you encounter. It means you're even more reliant on your default gun, and weapon energy management is more of a hassle. One of the biggest challenges in Rockman 3 is the enormous amount of slowdown in the game. Everything seems to grind the game to a halt, especially boss fights. It can really throw off your timing when suddenly everything stops. If I've been going on for quite a bit about the negative aspects of Rockman 3, it's because the positive ones are so well known. This is a spectacular game, one of the Famicom's best, an absolute classic of the 8-bit era. The stages are incredible, the boss fights are cool, and it presents a real challenge to the player. But then if you're the kind of person who'd watch videos all about Famicom games, you already knew that.